Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaea Viking. Today, the subject of today's video is a subject that is both well known and in many ways lesser known, or perhaps more accurately, misunderstood. And that subject is the Boxer Rebellion and its fight against foreign imperialism in China. So, right off the bat, I'm sure many of you who hear the phrase Boxer Rebellion, one probably only heard about it briefly, say in high school or middle school, or through movies like the Boxer Rebellion the movie that you see here. And perhaps you've heard that it was an event in China during the late 18th century where a group of martial arts fanatics believed that if they performed specific rituals, they could overcome firearms and other things such as that, and therefore could use martial arts to defeat uh, more powerful Western empires like the British Empire and the United States. So in some, usually most people when they hear about the Boxer Rebellion, they tend to think of the Boxers and the Boxer Rebellion as a rebellion started by a group of naive fanatics. But that's not necessarily the whole thing. And again, this is a trope that's been shown in a lot of popular media, including this movie, just simply titled "The Boxer Rebellion" from China. But as with most things, just because it's shown that way in popular media doesn't mean that it is accurate. Which now brings us to our first big section, the rise and decline of China's Qing dynasty. So, uh, starting in 1644 to 1681 CE, the Manchu ruled later Jin dynasty would invade and conquer the Ming dynasty of China. And then after the conquest of Ming Dynasty China by the Manchus was consolidated, they created the Qing Dynasty, upon which Qing emperors Kangxi and Qianlong would lead large-scale military campaigns, resulting in the conquests of Mongolia, Xinjiang, Korea, Tibet, Taiwan, and parts of Russia, with these periods of expansion and conquest happening between the 1650s and 1792 CE. And here is a map of the greatest extent of the Qing Empire or the Qing Dynasty of China. You'll notice that for the most part, that it looks like modern day China, and that's for a very good reason. It's because the reason modern day China looks the way it is because of the conquests of the Qing dynasty. Now, of course, there are some parts that are missing, such as this part of Russia here, and Mongolia, and this part of Kazakhstan, and this part of India. But generally, uh, this is pretty close to what we see in modern China now. Now, that being said, uh, the stability, or at least the illusion of stability brought on by the conquest of Kangxi and Qianlong would not last, as rebellions against Qing rule would become common in the waning years of Qianlong's reign and the reigns of succeeding emperors. And here's a map showing all the various ones. As a result of this, in an attempt to rebuild their economy, the Qing dynasty would adopt an isolationist policy in order to rebuild their economy and their infrastructure destroyed during these revolutions. That being said, they would allow limited trade with European empires and the United States between the 1790s and 1842 CE in a system known as the Canton system. And you can see a map of this Canton system here as well as here. This is specifically the United States participation, or a map of the United States' participation in the Canton system. Now, that being said, European empires, especially the British Empire, the French Empire, and the United States, would begin to illegally import large amounts of opium into China, violating the Qing dynasty's laws. This would then lead Qing officials to destroy thousands of cases of opium in response to the illegal importation. With this importation happening between 1800 and 1839 CE, or at least the height of it, and the destruction of the thousands of cases of opium happening in 1839 CE specifically. In response to the destruction of the imported opium, the restrictive Canton system, the British Empire would go on to defeat the Qing dynasty in the First Opium War in 1842 CE, and then the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, and the United States would go on to defeat the Qing dynasty in the Second Opium War in 1860 CE. Then, between 1850 and 1864, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom would ravage the Qing dynasty in a long and bloody civil war known as the Taiping Uprising. They would eventually be defeated by an alliance of the Qing dynasty, the British Empire, the French Empire, and the United States. In the wake of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Uprising, the Qing dynasty would initiate what is known as the self-strengthening movement in an attempt to modernize China. However, corruption in the Qing imperial court severely hampered the attempt to modernize, which made the self-strengthening movement only partially successful at best, and it was eventually abandoned by the Qing court. Now, I have already done an in-depth video on the expansion of the Qing dynasty, the Opium Wars and the Taiping Uprising, and the self-strengthening movement, all of which I will include in the iCard if y'all want to watch movies in greater detail about these subjects. But the self-strengthening movement would happen between 1861 and 1895 CE specifically. And the reason for that 1895 CE date is because the Japanese Empire would go on to defeat the Qing dynasty in the First Sino-Japanese War, which happened between 1894 and 1895 CE, with Japan having gone through a similar program or movement of modernization, and only in this case they actually succeeded because, in contrast to the Qing court, which was filled with corruption and had a lot of officials who were sort of hampering the process, as well as the fact that a lot of Western powers, including Britain and the United States, were sending outdated technology to Imperial China. In contrast to that, the Japanese Empire had the imperial court backing it, and they sent their own officials to Western countries to study, upon which these officials would then come back and use what they learned to modernize the country themselves, rather than attempting to fall back on whether or not Western countries like the United States or the British Empire were benevolent enough to give them up-to-date technology, among other things. There's more nuance to it. Again, I have already done a video on the Meiji Restoration and the Japanese Empire's modernization that I will include in the icon. Now, that all being said, the governor of the Chinese province of Jiangsu and later viceroy of Huguang, consisting of the provinces of Hubei and Hunan, Zhang Jidong, would then take it upon himself to invite German military officers to train Chinese soldiers in his province in modern military techniques. And he did this between 1884 and 1901 CE. Zhang Jidong specifically did this first while serving as the governor of Nanjing in 1894 CE, where he invited a group of German military officials, including 12 officers and 24 warrant officers, to train the local garrison into a modern military force. Then, in 1896 CE, acting under an imperial decree, Zhang moved to Wuchang to serve as the viceroy of Huguang, an area comprising of Hubei and Hunan provinces. Zhang would draw on his experience in Nanjing to modernize the military forces under his command in Huang. Zhang effectively trained and equipped modern units of sappers, engineers, cavalry, police, artillery, and infantry. And of the 62,000 men under his command, 20,000 men were directly trained by foreign officers, and a military academy was established in Wuchang in order to train future generations of soldiers. Zhang would then also go on to arm his soldiers with German Mauser rifles and other modern equipment. Foreign observers would then report that when their training was complete, the soldiers stationed in the Wuchang garrison were the equal of contemporary European forces. And here's the source. This is I got this information from. Now, before I go into the next section, I do have to say that one of the following slides shows an offensive image that does not reflect the views of myself, the author of this video. But that being said, it still is offensive, and I do need to warn y'all that it's going to come up. But I also need to point out that this image is being shown for educational purposes only. So again, it is disturbing and offensive, but it does not reflect the views of myself, the author of this video, and is only there for educational purposes. Now this brings us to our next section, the building blocks of the Boxer Rebellion. So between 1895 and 1901 CE, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Japanese Empire began to partition parts of China into their own spheres of influence during the era of New Imperialism, following the Qing dynasty's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War. This event and time period specifically became known as the Scramble for China. The United States would follow shortly after, with the United States annexing the Philippines in Asia after the Spanish-American War, and during the Philippine-American War, began viewing the Philippines as a stepping stone to carve out their own sphere of influence in China. Now, I've already done a in-depth video on the Philippine-American War, but just for quick overview, the Philippine-American War lasted between 1898 and 1902, as well as 1913 CE. The reason for this difference in end date is because some sections of the war ended earlier than others, and that's because some islands held out for far longer than others. Then, on September 6, 1899 CE, the United States issued the open door policy in an attempt to prevent China from being carved up by European empires like they did in Africa. This was done in the hopes of keeping trade in China open to all nations, which was beneficial to the interests of the United States. So I do need to point that out. It was not done out of the kindness of the United States' heart. It was done specifically for the hopes of monetary gain. Now, that being said, most European empires ignored the policy. They were essentially just sort of like, okay, sure, whatever, and then they went about their business. Then we begin to see in the 1890s the rise of social unrest that began to plague the northeastern Chinese coastal province of Shandong. Were several secret religious sects and martial societies, such as the Big Sword Society and the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, also known as the Boxers, began to develop in Shandong sometime in the early 1890s CE. Of course, given the secrecy of these groups, it's impossible, or at least nearly impossible, to determine when they actually began to form. But at least we know that they began to form sometime in the early 1890s. Then, in 1895 CE, despite being ambivalent towards the Big Sword Society and the Boxers, the provincial governor of Shandong, Yu Jian, would begin cooperating with them to combat bandit activities. Then, between the 1864 and the 1890s CE, Christian missionaries would begin to establish themselves in large numbers throughout China. At first, they were welcomed as they helped set up schools and hospitals in poor Chinese communities. However, bandits would also often convert to Christianity to avoid persecution and receive protection from the Chinese government. As a result, many Chinese began to see Christians and bandits as one and the same. Furthermore, many missionaries used their influence and privilege to intervene in lawsuits, creating more distrust of Christians in Chinese communities. Then, between the 1880s and 1890s, periods of drought and flood would ravage Shandong. And on top of this, in the 1890s, discontent among Chinese citizens would grow with the destruction of Chinese burial sites to make way for German railroads and telegraph lines. This discontent was further exacerbated when German soldiers shot Chinese protesters who protested the German railroads. And then on between November 1st and 2nd, 1897 CE, after a German Catholic priest, George Stins, was accused of serially raping Chinese women in Juya County, Shandong, the Big Sword Society attempted to kill Stins in his missionary quarters, but failed to find him and killed two other missionaries, with this event becoming known as the Juya Incident. In response to this, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, would dispatch the East Asia Squadron to China in response to the incident and would seize Jiaozhou Bay. Later, the German Empire was granted exclusive control of development of loans, mining, and railway ownership in Shandong province, effectively giving the German Empire control of the province and its economy. With this happening between November 1897 and March 1898 CE. Then in 1898 CE, reformers in the Qing court would attempt to introduce a national cultural, political, and educational reform known as the 100 Days Reform. With the goals of these reforms including abolishing the traditional examination system, eliminating sinecures, positions that provide little or no work but provide a salary, establishing Peking University as a place where sciences, liberal arts, and Chinese classics will be available for all the city, the establishment of agricultural schools in all provinces and schools and colleges in all provinces and cities, the building of a modern education system, which included things such as studying mathematics and science instead of focusing mainly on Confucian texts, the encouragement of imperial family members to study abroad, changing the government from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, applying principles of capitalism to strengthen the economy, modernizing China's military and adopting modern training and drill methods, establishing a naval academy, utilizing unused military land for farming, rapid industrialization, of all China through manufacturing, commerce, and capitalism, the establishment of trade schools for the manufacture of silk, tea, and other traditional Chinese crafts, and the establishment of a bureau for railways and mines. And here's where I got this information from. Unfortunately for the individuals who presented these reforms, Empress Dowager Shiji would see the reforms as a threat to her power, and so she would seize the throne in a coup and would execute these 6 officials responsible for said reforms. Then, on October 1898 CE, a group of boxers would attack the Christian community of the Liuwan Tun village, or a temple to the Jade Emperor, the chief Chinese deity, or one of the chief Chinese deities, had been converted into a Catholic church. This incident marked the first time the boxers began to use the slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigners." The violence toward the missionaries and Christians would draw sharp responses from diplomats protecting their nationals, including Western seizure of harbors and forts, and the moving in of troops in preparation for all-out war, as well as taking control of more land by force or by coercing long-term leases from the Qing. With this happening between 1897 and 1899 CE. Now this brings us to our next section in the meat of the video, the Boxer Rebellion. So, in 1899 CE, the Boxer movement would develop into a mass movement and would begin to be viewed by the Qing court and Chinese citizens as a means to help oppose foreign powers. The Boxers would then begin calling themselves the Militia United in Righteousness to portray themselves as a legitimate army, and they would go on to battle the Qing army, the Imperial Chinese army, in the Battle of Sinlo Temple in October 1899 CE. With a majority of the conservatives in the Qing court, Shiji would change her position on the Boxers and would issue edicts in their defense, causing protests from foreign powers. Shiji would urge provincial authorities to support the Boxers, although few did so. And she would do this in January of 1900 CE. The Boxer movement would then, in the spring of 1900 CE, spread rapidly north from Shandong into the countryside near Beijing. Boxers would burn Christian churches, kill Chinese Christians, and intimidate Chinese officials who stood in their way. And then, as their farms, it's important to point out, as their farms had been destroyed by drought and flood, many Chinese peasants in Shandong began to join the Boxers sometime in May of 1900 CE. And in fact, in May of 1900 CE, while traveling along China's Grand Canal, Charles Davis Jameson, a mining engineer from the United States, noted that, quote, the country was barren and burnt brown. Crops that should have been ready for the market were only a few inches above the ground and shriveled by the heat of the sun and the lack of water. God knows the people looked poor enough in this part of the country at any time, but they now seemed absolutely poverty stricken and on the verge of starvation. And here is the source that I got this excerpt from. But as you can see from this account, it's not surprising to see why many Chinese peasants were willing to join the Boxer movement because they felt they had no other choice to, because they couldn't even feed their families due to the drought and flooding. Then, also in May 1900 CE, the Boxers would begin attacking foreign military units, with the Boxers displaying a high degree of tactical planning, but often failed to defeat the military units and suffered heavy casualties. One such unit was a British military unit that was attacked on May 5th, 1900 CE, when, quote, the party was suddenly attacked by a large crowd of Chinese armed chiefly with agricultural implements and stones. Major Penrose was the main objective, and he was severely handled, especially with a bayonet wrested from him, and which had taken from one of the escort after emptying his revolver into the mob. Sergeant Pillay and the other men of the Royal Engineers also put in some good work with their pistols, while Mr. Schaller formed up the escort and kept the crowd off Major Penrose, who had by that time fallen. Things now began to look very serious for the crowd, though losing rapidly showed no signs of giving way. Individuals, possibly imbued with the Boxers' notions of invulnerability, repeatedly tried to come close quarters again, after once driven back. Several with more than one bullet in their bodies. As soon as things began to look serious, they withdrew up the hill on the right of their track and still maintained a running fight in the direction of the camp, about half a mile off. The Chinese had allowed for this, and a large number now appeared above the party and began throwing great stones at them. After lunch, about 2 p.m., we were surprised by hearing some shots. On looking up the valley, we saw a large mass of men moving in the direction of the shots, which turned out to be Major Penrose's escort, who were being attacked. All available men in the camp turned around and went to his assistance, and only got there just in time. The mob started to run, and some of them, headed by Captain Pereira, rushed them. A few turned back, and one put his pitchfork around Captain Pereira's neck and bore him to the ground, where he would have fared but ill had not one of his men, who was close behind him, bayoneted the assailant. And here's the source that I got this from. But as you can see, even though they lost, and even though they were only armed with farmers' implements, showing the fact that they were generally uh, peasants who had no formal military training, but even without formal military training, and even though they lost, the Boxers were showing a high degree of tactical planning to fight against a foreign military force. And then the Boxers would continue their attacks in Shandong, attacking Chinese Christians, missionaries, and railroad workers throughout May of 1900 CE. We can see an example of this happen on May 19th, 1900 CE, where local bishop Pierre Marie Alphonse Favier, or Favier, uh, who wrote a letter to French minister Stephen Pichon describing the situation. Favier stated that, quote, in the prefecture of Pao-Ting-Fu, more than 70 Christians have been massacred. Near Icheiro, only 3 days ago, 3 neophytes have been cut into pieces. Many villages have been pillaged and burned. A great many others have been completely abandoned. More than 2,000 Christians are fleeing without bread, without clothing, and without shelter. So, as you can see in the source, the attacks on Chinese Christians and foreign Christians, as well as railroad workers, among many others, was becoming even more widespread than it had already been just a few weeks earlier. And here's the source that I got this information from. Then on May 30th, 1900 CE, diplomats led by Claude MacDonald requested that foreign soldiers come to Beijing to defend the foreign legations. The Chinese government reluctantly acquiesced, and the next day, a multinational force of 435 Navy soldiers from 8 countries disembarked from warships and traveled by train from the Dongyu forts to Beijing. Then on June 5th, 1900 CE, the railway line to Tianjin, the city of Tianjin, was cut by Boxers in the countryside, isolating the capital city of Beijing. Then on June 10th, 1900 CE, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the Japanese Empire, the German Empire, the United States, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Kingdom of Italy formed an 8-nation alliance against the Boxers and the Qing dynasty. Already embroiled in other wars, the British Empire and the United States were forced to redirect soldiers from the Second Boer War and the Philippine-American War, respectively. Then on June 11th, 1900 CE, the secretary of the Japanese legation, Sugiyama Akira, was attacked and killed by the forces of General Dong Fujian, who were guarding the southern part of Beijing's wall, specifically called the Tartar. Then, also on June 11th, the German minister Clemens von Kettler and German soldiers captured a Boxer boy and executed him. In response to the execution, thousands of Boxers burst into Beijing that afternoon and burned many of the Christian churches and cathedrals in the city. Foreign soldiers took shelter in missions and embassies and the foreign legations. This allowed the foreign soldiers to repulse several Boxer attacks. In response, the Gansu Braves, an Imperial Chinese force, and the Boxers, along with other Chinese soldiers and citizens, then attacked and killed Chinese Christians around the legations in revenge for the foreign attacks on the Chinese. Now this brings us to our next section, the soldiers and weapons of the Boxer Rebellion. Starting with the soldiers of the Boxers and the Qing Imperial Army. So the Boxers numbered roughly between 100,000 and 300,000. However, it's important to note they had no centralized leadership and varied in uniform depending on the Boxer group and individual the Boxer group and individual came from, which you can see in this picture here and here, and this picture here. And in terms of weapons, initially many of the Boxers were armed primarily with farming implements, which you can see here. or traditional Chinese weapons, such as the Jian sword or the various variations of the Dao saber swords, such as the Dao Dao or the Miao Dao, various other versions, as well as traditional Chinese pole arms, such as the Guando, or sorry, the Guandao, and the Chinese spear. Uh, and in their early battles, the only guns available to the Boxers were outdated and cumbersome muzzle-loading Jingal guns, which you can see here. Though later on, the Qing army would supply the Boxers with a variety of modern rifles, such as the Snyder Enfield rifle, the Model 1892 CE Winchester rifle, which real quick, I do want to put it aside. I've heard multiple times in my past few videos, people say, "Oh, Jane, the Model 1892 is the model. It's not necessarily the year that the gun was made." I understand that. However, for consistency with the way my videos are and the dating system in my videos, I'm still including the CE with the model number because that is the year that the gun was developed. So while I know that's not necessarily when the gun was made, it's still I'm still putting the CE there for consistency due to the fact that that is when the gun was invented. So sorry, gun owners, I know it's annoying, but this is what you're getting. Anyways, they were provided with Model 1892 CE Winchester rifles, Model 1892 CE Marlin rifles, Model 1895 CE Mousers, Model 1895 CE Mannlichers, among others. Meanwhile, the Qing Imperial Army had roughly 100,000 soldiers and was generally had the same uniforms worn in preceding wars. And they were, again, similar to the Boxers, equipped with traditional Chinese swords, seen here, and traditional Chinese pole arms. And they were still equipped with the cumbersome Jingals. However, these were more up-to-date versions of the Jingal gun that were now bolt action guns and were primarily used for defending fortress walls. Though, of course, they were still cumbersome, which you can see in this picture here. I mean, look at the size of this gun compared to the guy holding it. That being said, the Qing army was also equipped with a variety of imported European rifles, such as the Model 1895 Mauser, the Model 1895 Mannlicher, the Dreyse needle gun, the Hanyang Type 88, as well as being equipped with both imported German artillery and artillery modeled after German artillery, which actually gave the Qing army a slight advantage in both offensive and defensive siege warfare. And you can see the various types of German artillery that they had. Such as the Krupp naval gun, and here's actually a design from Chinese military manuals with slightly different Chinese versions that were modeled after the Krupp guns. And here's some more examples here from the Jiangnan arsenal. And here's some more models here, such as the Far Panzer cannon, which can be dragged via horse here and here. And then here are ship cannons used for coastal defense. Now this brings us to what did the armies and weapons of the eight-nation alliance look like? Well, for one thing, the Allied force had roughly, at its height, had roughly 50,000 soldiers, with most of these belonging to the Russian Empire, the Japanese Empire, and the British Empire. And of course, it's important to note their uniforms varied depending on which nation that they originated from. And of course, similarly, the Allied forces were equipped with a diverse set of modern rifles, with rifles varying depending on a soldier's country of origin, including the Gewehr Model 1898 CE, the Meiji 22 Murata magazine rifle, the Type 30 Arisaka rifle, the Springfield Model 1892 CE Krag Jorgensen rifle, the Winchester Lee, also known as the Lee Navy rifle, the Snyder Enfield rifle, the Lee Metford rifle, the 1891 CE Moisen Nagant, as well as the Allied forces being equipped with a diverse set of modern handguns, with, again, handguns varying depending on the soldier's country of origin, which you can see that here. Believe it or not, these guns are from two different nations, though they do look very similar. And again, that's because this is a Mauser and this is a gun based on Mauser. The Mauser was a very common design that nations copied at the time. And also, again, given the diversity of nations, the Allied forces were equipped with a diverse set of modern artillery, again, depending on a soldier's country of origin, which you can see here, here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the Seymour expedition. So, between June 9th and 10th, 1900 CE, British Vice Admiral Sir Howard Hobart Seymour would gather a force of 2,000 sailors and marines from European, United States, and Japanese warships. His force would then depart for the city of Tianjin and head towards Beijing using 5 commandeered trains, expecting the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese forces, the Qing army, to be easy opponents to defeat. From this point forward in the video, I'm going to refer to the Qing army as the Imperial Chinese forces because obviously the Boxers and the Qing army were fighting for the Qing dynasty at this point in time, so it could get a little confusing. They were both armies, so for this case, I'm going to refer to the Boxers as Boxers, and the Imperial and the Qing army is the Imperial Chinese forces. So the Boxers and Imperial Chinese forces would actually, despite assumptions of being easy opponents, would regularly destroy the railways used by Seymour's force, which would force Seymour's force to constantly repair the railways, severely slowing and hampering the expedition, with all this happening between June 10th and 18th, 1900 CE. And then on top of that, the Boxers would repeatedly raid Seymour's force. At first, they would perform rituals prior to battle, resulting in the Boxers being shot by Seymour's force. These rituals being rituals that were at first believed to give them some form of invulnerability against bullets. But of course, that was not the case. In response, the Boxers would very quickly adopt more formal and organized combat tactics to combat Seymour's force, which they used to great effect. With again these happening between June 10th and 18th, 1900 CE. In fact, soldiers in Seymour's force repeatedly stated that the Boxers were ferocious and determined fighters, with one soldier stating that in raids, the Lee Metford rifle, quote, failed altogether to stop these pertinacious swordsmen unless struck in a vital spot. And here's the source that I got that quote from. On top of that, the Boxers were also noted to have invented clever tactics designed to simply lure Seymour's force into stopping its expedition and forming defensive fortifications, which will then further slow the expedition. One such tactic was the use of firecrackers to mimic gunfire, as seen in one incident where the expedition halted and formed defensive lines upon hearing gunfire. A Japanese captain then realized what was actually happening and shouted, quote, firecrackers! The order was given to fix bayonets, followed by the charge. The mixed line of American, British, French, and Japanese rushed forward on the double, all yelling at the top of our voices. We passed through the village, and as usual, not the vestige of a Chinaman was to be seen. Firecrackers were added to the list of defensive weapons. And then the expedition would respond to these tactics by burning any Chinese village they encountered. And here's the source that I got this from. But as you can see, These sources alone show that despite assumptions by Seymour and the expedition that the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese Army that they would be easy opponents, this was very much not the case. They were very adept at the very least, stalling the expedition, and you were very skilled in coming up with new tactics to combat them that were very successful. Then, on June 18th, 1900 CE, Chinese General Dong Fuxiang would lead a part of the Imperial Chinese Army known as the Gansu Braves to reinforce the Boxers. Together, the Boxers and the Gansu Braves would ambush Seymour's expedition at Longfong. The Gansu Braves specifically launched cavalry charges into the expedition's defensive lines, and despite suffering high casualties, the Boxers and the Gansu Braves also inflicted high casualties on the expedition. As a result, the expedition retreated back to Tianjin, ending the Battle of Longfong and the Chinese victory. Well, this battle happening on June 18th, 1900 CE. On the retreat back to Tianjin, the expedition continued to be hampered by raids from Boxers and the Imperial Chinese Army. Furthermore, the Boxers destroyed the bridge crossing the Hai River, forcing the expedition to cross the river and walk the 18 miles back to Tianjin. At Beikong, the expedition encountered a large Boxer and Imperial Chinese force that was fortified in nearby villages. The expedition barely escaped this, suffering heavy casualties as they came under heavy fire from the Boxers and Imperial Chinese soldiers in the fortified villages, and many of the boats carrying the expedition's artillery were destroyed. However, soldiers in the expedition noted that they were surprised that the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese army preferred to stay behind their fortifications rather than overwhelm them with their superior numbers and artillery. Though it is also important to note that this was possibly a choice made due to past experiences where larger Chinese forces were destroyed by smaller foreign forces with superior artillery. So perhaps so it's very likely that the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese Army were learning from what they were learning from past mistakes, and unbeknownst to them, those past mistakes were not necessarily relevant to this specific battle. But regardless, it is also important to note they were learning from past mistakes. So, you can't win everything. But this event happened between June 21st and 22nd, 1900 CE. Then, on June 23rd, 1900 CE, the expedition discovered a nearby Imperial Chinese arsenal known as the Great Shiku Arsenal had been abandoned. The expedition then quickly seized the arsenal and took shelter in it. Eventually, on June 25th, 1900 CE, the expedition was able to send a messenger to the Allied forces laying siege to Tianjin, which was now occupied by a large and well-armed force of Boxers and Imperial Chinese soldiers. A force of 2,000 foreign soldiers was then dispatched to guide the expedition back to Tianjin, ending Seymour's expedition in failure and a Chinese victory. Well, this happened between June 25th and 28th, 1900 CE. Now we are going to look at a different event that was happening simultaneously with Seymour's expedition, and that is the foreign seizure of the Daku forts. So, on June 16th, 1900 CE, Russian Admiral Yakov Hildebrandt, British Rear Admiral Christopher Craddock, and German Admiral Hugo von Pohl decided to seize the Chinese Daku forts along the Pine River. Multiple destroyers, such as the HMS Fame and the HMS Whiting, were dispatched to attack the forts, as well as multiple gunboats, which are smaller attack boats. Expecting an attack from the Eight Nation Alliance, the Imperial Chinese forces at the forts placed mines in the river and opened fire with every piece of artillery present in the forts simultaneously upon the arrival of the Alliance fleet. This resulted in the destruction of multiple alliance ships and led to an incredibly hard-fought battle for both sides, with this happening on June 17th, 1900 CE. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the Alliance forces were eventually able to seize the forts after heavy fighting, ending the battle for the Taku forts in an Allied victory on June 17th, 1900 CE. Now this brings us to our next section and an interesting event that happened during the Boxer Rebellion, the Mutual Defense Pact of the southeastern Chinese provinces. So, on June 21st, 1900 CE, Empress Dowager Cixi would issue an imperial decree officially declaring war on the Allied forces. However, the few Chinese governors and generals with successfully modernized armies, including Zhang Zhidong, Li Hongzhang, Yuan Shikai, and Liu Kunyi, all of them ignored the imperial decree. Together, Zhidong, Hongzhang, Shikai, and Kunyi would form the Mutual Defense Pact of the southeastern provinces and would ally themselves with the Eight Nation Alliance and would suppress Boxer activities in their provinces between 1900 and, depending on the individual, 1901 to 1902 CE. As some battles between Boxers and their forces were happening sporadically well into 1902 CE. And here is a map of the Mutual Defense Pact of southeastern China, where you can see Zhang Zhidong's area, Li Hongzhang's area, Liu Kunyi's area, and Yuan Shikai's area, among a couple of others. Now this brings us to our next section, the Siege of Tianjin. So, as a result of the Allied capture of the Taku forts, the Imperial Chinese army would side with the Boxers on June 17th, 1900 CE. Led by Chinese General Ni Shicheng, or Xiqing, a force of 15,000 Imperial Chinese soldiers and 17,000 Boxers would attack and seize the city of Tianjin from a small number of Allied forces present between June 17th and June 21st, 1900 CE. The Allied forces would attempt to retake the city, but were repeatedly repulsed by Chinese artillery and rifle fire, suffering heavy casualties between June 21st and July 13th, 1900 CE. In fact, the Chinese artillery was so effective, Allied enclaves around Tianjin were under constant barrage. One account states that, quote, hardly house but had been struck by shells. The valuable contents of the warehouse going to form barricades to keep out the bullets, which lay thick about every street and studded every tree and wall. It was indeed a different spectacle. Women and children were to be seen no longer, and the two clubs were both turned into hospitals, which by this time were nearly crowded with wounded officers and men. So, in sum, the Imperial Chinese army and the Boxers were winning, and they were showing that they were, in fact, despite assumptions by the Eight Nation Alliance, were in fact incredibly skilled in the use of modern artillery and rifles. And we see a further example of this in the description of the accuracy of Chinese rifle fire, which began to be viewed suspiciously, with some Allied soldiers believing Russian gunnery instructors were responsible. However, other Allied soldiers, such as British Captain A.A. Barnes, were skeptical of these rumors, with Barnes stating that, quote, there were several solutions offered. One was that before hostilities actually broke out, the Chinese forcibly detained 8 of their Russian gunnery instructors and compelled them at the point of the bayonet to lay their guns for them. It was even asserted one day that one of these luckless individuals had escaped into the Russian camp, more dead than alive, with the story of his woes. But I never saw him, nor heard the story actually verified. What is more likely is this explanation: most of the foreign trained gunners from the Taku forts made their way when these fell to Tianjin and served the guns uh, there with that accuracy of which we had daily demonstration. That Tianjin settlement was overrun with spies I have already mentioned, and these men, no doubt, gave their friends in the city early and very accurate information of all our plans, our movements, and the exact position of all our guns, which made it an easy matter for the enemy with their accurate maps and knowledge of the ground to make things lively for us. And here's the source I got that from. But as you can see in the source, yet again, despite assumptions by the Eight Nation Alliance, the Imperial Chinese Army and the Boxers were indeed very skilled marksmen. Uh, but of course, they couldn't accept that. They just had to assume that it was something else, like Russian gunnery instructors performing the firing. But again, that was very much not the case. In fact, it was the opposite case. So then, between June 25th and July 13th, 1900 CE, after rescuing the defeated Seymour expedition, the Eight Nation Alliance gathered a force of roughly 7,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 20 pieces of artillery to lay siege to Tianjin. Similar to the Seymour expedition, the Allied forces at Tianjin believed the Chinese forces on the city wall would be easily defeated. However, they were repulsed multiple times by Chinese artillery and sniper fire, suffering heavy casualties. In fact, British Captain A. A. Barnes watched the initial assault on Tianjin and noted that, quote, all this time our guns, which had the range to a nicety, were sweeping great chunks off the top of the city wall, with no doubt a due portion of its defenders, but the fire never seemed to slacken or give the Allies a chance to get up to the wall. As the evening approached, a certain gloom seemed to come over the settlement, and there were those that pointed to the day and the date as an indication of failure. It was Friday the 13th, though their pessimism was quite at fault. It was, however, a dismal day, for all the time there came in mournful procession of wounded British, American, and Japanese in stretchers, in carts, in rickshaws, and hobbling painfully along, which told its own tale of the desperate fighting among those ruins. Which, again, as I've already stated, shows that the shows that the Eight Nation Alliance was very clearly severely underestimating the Imperial Chinese Army and the Boxers because of their perceived, quote, superiority. And we're very, very quickly finding out that they were very much wrong. In addition to the effectiveness of the Chinese artillery and rifle fire, the Allied forces were highly disorganized. And this was due to each force fighting as representatives of individual nations rather than a unified force. On top of this disunity, the distinctive dark blue colors of the United States Marines and the Japanese Imperial soldiers made them recognizable and easy targets for Chinese snipers, which you can see in this picture and this picture here. However, on July 14th, 1900 CE, at nightfall, as the Chinese artillery and rifle fire lulled, a group of Japanese Imperial soldiers used explosives to destroy the south gate of Tianjin, which allowed the Allied forces to storm and take the city, but only after heavy fighting, which ended the siege of Tianjin in an Allied victory. The Allied forces would then begin to indiscriminately loot the city, with the looting in Tianjin being so widespread that a United States lieutenant noted that, quote, soldiers of all nations joined the orgy. Many of the Allies staggered through the streets, arms packed and piled with silks and furs and brocades with gold and silver and jewels. And here's the source that I got this information from. And then British Captain A. Barnes would go on to justify and excuse the looting, stating that, quote, looting is, of course, a bad man's job at best, but I think when men have been exposed to all sorts of danger through no fault of their own, from a city that has more or less voluntarily sheltered hordes of the most cruel fanatics the world has ever seen, you must not be too hard on them if their human nature gets a little the upper hand of their finer feelings. And here's the source that I got this information from here. So as you can see, in the eyes of A.A. Barnes and many of the individuals looting Tianjin, uh, it was essentially viewed as like, well, you caused a lot of you shot a lot of our men, you caused us a lot of pain and etc. So therefore, we're justified in stealing your stuff. Now, that being said, it's important to note that not all members of the Allied forces present approved of the looting. One such example is the white American photographer James Rickleton, who stated that, quote, men and women were fleeing, carrying their precious heirlooms, their jewels, their furs, their silks, their embroidery, and their money. These much prized valuables were snatched from them, and they dared not protest. They could not protest. They could not even tell that they were not boxers, but their lives were dearer than their most cherished jade stones, and they were even thankful to escape with life and honor. One's property depreciates wonderfully when his life is imperiled. I saw a native woman surrender their dearest belongings almost in a spirit of gratitude that life was not demanding. Looting from an enemy bent on taking your life as well as your property is justifiable by natural quid pro quo equivalency or by the law of reprisal as well as by the Old Testament code. But indiscriminate plunder of friend and foe is robbery, and robbery is robbery even in war. The looting by the Allies was not confined to the enemy, nor even to the Chinese, but extended to the European settlement, where temporarily vacated homes of Europeans were entered and plundered. Shamefully looted, China has had a lesson in the ethics of Christian armies she will not soon forget. And here's the information I got that from. But as you can see, Rickleton is very critical of the looting that was occurring. Now, to be fair, he wasn't like he was clearly not very completely against it, being that he said, "Oh, looting, stealing from an enemy is okay and is okay by the Old Testament code and things such as that." So, there is that. But regardless, he was still made a point to point out that what was happening in Tianjin was horrible and should not be happening. Now this brings us to our next section, the Gassili expedition. So, in August 1900 CE, the Eight Nation Alliance would place British General Sir Alfred Gassili in command of a new expeditionary force of roughly 20,000 Allied soldiers, with this force consisting primarily of Japanese, Russian, British, French, and United States soldiers. Though, of course, there were soldiers from Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy as well. The expedition would then march toward Beijing, but suffered heavily from severe illnesses, unsanitary conditions, diarrhea, flies, and other pests. Additionally, the expedition suffered from the summer heat, which led to widespread dehydration. On top of this, the Imperial Chinese Army would hamper the expedition by destroying railways and bridges and would flood areas around the Hai River. In conjunction, they used boats to construct bridges for their own travel across the river, with the Boxers then also using these tactics to and the Imperial Chinese Army using these tactics to ambush the expedition. Then, on August 5th, 1900 CE, Chinese General Dong Fuzhong would gather a force of roughly 11,000 Imperial Chinese soldiers at the Great Shiku Arsenal in the city of Beikong, using the flooded Hai River as an additional fortification. The Allied forces would attack the Great Shiku Arsenal, but many, including the United States Marines and British cavalry, were unable to approach due to the flooding of the Hai River. The only contingent of the expedition unimpeded by the flooding and the fortifications were the Imperial Japanese soldiers, who were able to defeat the Imperial Chinese Army in an assault and forced them to retreat. However, they suffered more casualties than the Imperial Chinese Army, though this did end the Battle of Beikong in an Allied victory on August 5th, 1900 CE. Then on August 6, 1900 CE, the Imperial Chinese Army would regroup at Yangchun, using the flooded High River and a railroad embankment as their fortifications. The first contingents of the expeditionary force to engage the Imperial Chinese Army were the United States Marines and the British infantry. The United States Marines bore the brunt of the Chinese resistance as they advanced on the strongest Chinese positions behind the railroad embankment. Furthermore, most of the Marines had already exhausted the water in their canteens, which would lead many Marines to collapse from dehydration and heat stroke. In fact, United States Sergeant Frederick Wise describes the experience of the United States Marines, stating that, quote, the plain in front of us was a furnace. Dust rose in thick clouds. There was no air to breathe. That heavy heat and dust left us choking. As we started forward, there was a crash of sound at our rear. Our own artillery firing over our heads was covering our advance. We advanced 1,000 yards. Down on us every step of the way beat the blazing sun, heavier every second. Another 1,000 yards. My men began to stagger again. They were taut and game, but all in. Here, one turned ghastly white. There, one dropped dead from heat. More and more men were staggered. And here's the source that I got this information from. But as you can see, while they were advancing, arguably what was causing the most casualties in this battle was not even the Imperial Chinese Army, but the lack of water and the severe heat in the area. Despite these high casualties from heat stroke and dehydration, the United States Marines were able to force the Imperial Chinese Army to retreat, which ended the Battle of Yangchun in an Allied victory on August 6, 1900 CE. In fact, the Battle of Yangchun ended Imperial Chinese resistance to the Gasly expedition. In conjunction, most Boxers began to return to their farms as rain had ended the droughts and made farming possible again, which allowed the expedition to continue to Beijing unimpeded. That being said, despite no longer facing attacks from the Boxers, the expedition continued to suffer greatly from the summer heat. In fact, United States Lieutenant Smedley Butler describes the heat the expedition faced, stating that, quote, there was no shade, not a drop of rain, nor a breath of air. The cavalry and the artillery kicked up clouds of dust, which beat back in our faces. The blistering heat burned our lungs. Nearly 50% of our men fell behind during the day, overcome by the sun. In the cool of the night, they would catch up with us and start on again the next morning. Our throats were parched, our tongues thick. We were cautioned not to drink the water, but no orders could keep us from drinking anything that was liquid. And here's the source that I got this information from. And then British Lieutenant Colonel H.B. Vaughan describes how even the soldiers who did not collapse from the heat were not ready for combat, stating that, quote, at one point we marched through an American detachment. The men were marching slowly along about 2 miles an hour, with heads bent and eyes half closed, as though sleeping or dead tired. Though utterly knocked up by the heat, yet determined to stick to it and come into camp on their own feet. I don't think they even noticed us as we passed them. And here's the source that I got this information from. But as you can see, while they were not facing attacks from the Imperial Chinese Army or the Boxers, they were still suffering heavy casualties. Much like the Battle of Yangchun, it's very clear that the biggest contribution and cause of the casualty rate of the Gasly expedition was the summer weather and heat and dehydration, not the battles with the Imperial Chinese Army or the Boxers. And then eventually, despite all this, the Gasly expedition would arrive at Beijing on August 14th, 1900 CE. Which now brings us to our next section, something that was happening before and also during the Seymour and Gassily expeditions, the siege of the international legations. So between June 19th and 20th, 1900 CE, after the capture of the Taku forts, Empress Dowager Cixi would send a diplomatic note to each of the international legations, ordering all foreigners to depart Beijing for Tianjin within 24 hours. German Minister Clemens von Kittler would attempt to take the matter to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, but was assassinated by a Chinese officer on his way to the minister. In response, the foreign ministers would order all foreigners to seek refuge in the legation quarter. And while this was happening, roughly 160,000 Imperial Chinese soldiers and boxers, led reluctantly by the anti-boxer general Rong Lu, would lay siege to the legations between June 20th and August 14th, 1900 CE. During this time, British Minister Sir Claude MacDonald was selected as the commander of the defense, and Herbert G. Squires, a white American diplomat, became his chief of staff. During the siege, the most effective foreign defenders were Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Shibagoro, who repeatedly fought off Chinese assaults, and United States Captain John Twiggs Myers, who successfully forced Chinese soldiers from a heavily fortified wall known as the Tartar Wall. That being said, despite being unable to take the legations, the Chinese attacks remained consistent and determined. In fact, white American missionary N.N. Russell describes the repeated attacks during the siege, stating that, quote, from June 20th to July 17th, we had daily and nightly attacks. Sometimes they lasted for 3 and 4 hours, and at other times only half an hour, sometimes on all sides, and again, only on one side. The night attacks came between midnight and 2 a.m. Major Conger said some of them for furious firing exceeded anything he experienced in the Civil War. One night we had a terrible thunder shower, and all the time we had a furious general attack. The soldiers on the wall said it seemed as though all hell had broken loose. And here's the source that I got this information from. But as you can see, despite being able to hold off the Imperial Chinese Army and the Boxers, the Imperial Chinese Army and Boxers were also, in a way, winning the siege. They were preventing the international legations from being able to escape, and were at this point most certainly starving them out. Meanwhile, in the Imperial Chinese court, the anti-boxer and anti-foreigner forces would begin arguing over the siege, which would lead to further instability in Beijing, and Imperial soldiers and boxers would begin to occasionally fight amongst themselves. Because of this, Empress Dowager Cixi would declare a truce on June 25th, 1900 CE. However, the truce would fall apart after only a few hours. Then on July 17th, 1900 CE, Cixi would declare a ceasefire, which would remain in place for the remainder of the siege. Which now brings us to our next section, the Battle of Beijing. So, as we said in the section on the Gassily expedition would arrive at Beijing on August 14th, 1900 CE, and would begin planning a siege and assault on the city. The siege would be initiated on August 14th, 1900 CE, and would become a race as each nation's contingent of the expedition began competing to get to the legations first. After heavy fighting, the expedition was able to take most of Beijing and relieve the foreign legations. However, despite seizing most of Beijing, a large Imperial Chinese army led by Dong Fujiang and Rong Lu continued to occupy the wall of the inner city and the Forbidden City, the location of the Imperial court, with them taking up defensive positions in this area on August 15th, 1900 CE. Meanwhile, Empress Dowager Cixi and several members of her court would dress as peasant women and would flee Beijing in the early morning of August 15th, 1900 CE. The Allied forces would then launch a hard-fought assault and seize the Forbidden City, officially ending the Battle of Beijing, though minor engagements would continue for a few days. Now this brings us to our next section, the Russian invasion of Manchuria, which happened again before and during both the Seymour and Gasly expeditions. The Russian army, led by individuals such as Admiral Yevgeny Ivanovich Alexeyevich and Dejan Subotic, would use the Boxer Rebellion as an excuse to invade Manchuria in June of 1900 CE. Similar to the Seymour expedition, though, the Boxers would destroy railways and bridges to hamper the Russian advance, with the biggest example of this happening on June 27th, 1900 CE. That being said, despite the destruction of the railways, the Russian Cossack cavalry was able to retake the railways and keep them under Russian control. Then, between July 17th and 21st, 1900 CE, Lieutenant General Konstantin Serpitsky would order the expulsion of all Qing subjects who remained north of the Amur River. As a result, the Russian army conducted an ethnic cleansing in Manchuria, massacring 7,000 members of the Manchu, Daur, and Han ethnic groups. In conjunction, the Cossack cavalry would burn many villages in many Manchu villages in the region, with this event becoming known as the 1900 CE Amur anti-Chinese pogroms. Then, between July 20th and 22nd, 1900 CE, the Russian army would defeat the Imperial Chinese army and Boxers in multiple battles along the Amur River. And then between June 29th and November of 1900 CE, the Russian army would annihilate the Imperial Chinese army and Boxers in northern and central Manchuria, though the Imperial Chinese army would then return and retaliate by burning Russian villages across the Chinese-Russian border, though the Russian army would then be able to, regardless of this, be able to seize control of Manchuria after heavy fighting. Which now brings us to our next section, the Allied occupation and atrocities in Beijing, Tianjin, and Jili. Now, first off, one of the events that happened during this occupation was that the British Lord Salisbury and German Ambassador Paul von Hatzfeldt would sign the Yangtze Agreement on behalf of the British and German empires, respectively, to oppose the partition of China into spheres of influence. With this agreement being a tentative at best endorsement of the United States open door policy. Though it's important to note that the German Empire supported the policy simply because a partition of China would limit Germany to a small trading market instead of all of China. With the signing of this agreement happening on October 6, 1900 CE. All right, now we're going to go into the meat of the atrocities that were committed upon the Chinese populace by the Eight Nation Alliance. And I do have to give a trigger warning here. Disturbing material is about to be described in the next few slides, including rape and various other horrific acts. So, Beijing specifically was split between the Allied forces, with each contingent governing a separate part of the city, with the Allied forces beginning indiscriminate looting of Beijing, with Gasly remembering that, quote, the condition in and about the city along the line of communication was bad, looting of the city, uncontrolled foraging in surrounding country, seizure by soldiers of everything a Chinaman might have as vegetables, eggs, chicken, sheep, cattle, etc. And he goes on to say that there is there was, quote, indiscriminate and generally unprovoked shooting of Chinese, and also goes on to state that for every one, quote, real boxer killed has been killed since the capture of Beijing, 50 harmless laborers were killed, including, quote, not a few women and children. So, and here's the source I got this information from. But as you can see from Gasly's description, the Eight Nation Alliance was essentially unhindered and uncontrolled, and was absolutely ravaging and devastating both Beijing and the Chinese populace inside Beijing. On top of this, soldiers from the Eight Nation Alliance raped many women in Beijing, including all 7 daughters of Chinese Viceroy Yulu and the wife and daughter of Mongol banner noble Chang Qi. Chang Qi and several of his family members, including his son, would then kill themselves shortly after on August 26, 1900 CE. On top of this, the Allied forces were reported to rape, loot, and burn, to have raped, loot, and burned throughout the occupied regions without mercy. And as a result, many women and Chinese women and girls committed suicide by the hundreds in order to escape rape at the hands of Japanese and Russian soldiers. And unsurprisingly, the Allied forces executed thousands of boxers by methods such as beheading and a execution method known as standing strangulation, which you can see here. And many Manchu officials and officers such as Yu Jian and Prince Zhuang were executed. Now that we've gone through all that very disturbing information, now it is time to look at our next section, the end of the Boxer Rebellion. So, on September 7th, 1901 CE, the Empress Dowager Qiji and the Imperial Chinese court agreed to sign the Boxer Protocol, also known as the peace agreement between the Eight Nation Alliance and China. The protocol specifically ordered the execution of 10 high-ranking officials linked to the outbreak of the Boxer Rebellion and other officials involved in the slaughter of foreigners in China. China was fined war reparations of 450 million taels of silver, of fine silver, for the loss that it caused, with the reparation to be paid by 1940 within 39 years. And it would eventually be 982,238,150 taels of silver, with interest at 4% year at a 4% year included. When adjusted for inflation, the reparation is 61 billion United States dollars. So in other words, it was a crippling sum. It was a crippling amount of money that Imperial China was forced to repay to the Eight Nation Alliance as part of the war reparations. The protocol also called for the destruction of the Taku forts, and that the foreign legations be forever under the exclusive control of foreign powers. And the protocol also called for the Chinese emperor to officially convey his regrets to German Kaiser Wilhelm II for the death of Clemens von Ketteler. And with all that being said, it is important to note that the Imperial Chinese court only partially agreed to the demands for the execution of imperial officials involved in the war, as seen in the outright refusal of the court to execute Dong Fujiang. In addition to this, the court also refused to exile pro-boxer Prince Dulan. All right, so with that, we're now coming to our last section, or one of our last sections, the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion. So, for one thing, Christian missionaries massacred during the Boxer Rebellion were canonized as martyrs in the Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox churches, which you can see examples of Protestant Chinese martyrs here and Eastern Orthodox Chinese martyrs here. With this martyrdom of Chinese Christians happening between 1900 and 1902 CE. That being said, another thing that happened as part of the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion is that the Boxers were praised by Chinese revolutionaries such as Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was himself already building a revolutionary movement both before and during the Boxer Rebellion, and a young Mao Zedong who would participate in a later revolution against the Imperial Qing dynasty. Now, we need to return to the Russian occupation of Manchuria, which actually resulted in the United States sending a formal protest to the Russian Empire, calling the Russian invasion of Manchuria a violation of the open door policy. Though, of course, the Russian Empire ignored the protest because most of the time when the United States tried to use these protests and sanctions during this period of time, they were sort of seen as a backwater country by most European empires, like the Russian Empire, and we're just sort of seen as like, yeah, okay, whatever. And again, as I said earlier in the video, where most empires went about their business. And this formal protest of the Russian Empire happened in 1902 CE. Then, because of the Russian invasion of Manchuria, tensions between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire of said occupation of Manchuria during the Boxer Rebellion would, in part, though not in entirety, of course, lead to the eventual Russo-Japanese War, which is already talked about in my video on the Meiji Restoration, ended in a Japanese imperial victory. And in fact, the United States would go on to help negotiate, would go on to help negotiate the end of the Russo-Japanese War, with Japan gaining control of Manchuria. Afterwards, the Japanese Empire and the United States governments would pledge to maintain a policy of equality in Manchuria as part of the United States open door policy. However, again, unsurprisingly, Japan quickly began ignoring the policy in order to expand their territory further into China. With this agreement between the Japanese Empire and the United States lasting between 1905 and 1907 CE. Then, as I mentioned already a little bit earlier, the Boxer Rebellion inspired revolutionaries. And another thing it did is it further eroded the already declining support for the Qing dynasty, which would result in revolutionaries who were already inspired by the Boxer Rebellion, such as Dr. Sun Yat-sen, to form an alliance of anti-Qing groups that would eventually become known as the Tongminghui. With this organization specifically forming on August 20th, 1905 CE. Then, on May 25th, 1908 CE, the United States would remit roughly $12 million of its share of the indemnity to support the education of Chinese students in the United States for the next 40 years, and would also begin the construction of the Tsinghua University in Beijing. Then, between October 10th, 1911 and February 12th, 1912 CE, the Tongminghui would overthrow the Qing dynasty in the Xinhai Revolution and would establish the Republic of China. Then, in 1917 CE, the already weak United States open door policy was further weakened after the Japanese Empire was promised the German colonies in Asia by the Triple Entente at the end of World War I. And we can see an example of this here in this map, the German colonial possessions in Asia in this brown shape here. And then after World War I, you can see that same area absorbed into the Japanese Empire. Now, something that's also important to note is you can see these symbols, the United States here and here. All these islands would also, after World War II, become United States possessions. All right, now this brings us to our last section, concluding thoughts. So we need to sort of address the sort of elephant in the room that is the myth connected to the Boxer Rebellion, and that is the Boxers and the myth of European and United States superiority. So often the Boxers are portrayed in popular media, both past and present, as superstitious fanatics who, along with the Imperial Chinese army, stood no chance against the more advanced and superior might of European empires and the United States. However, history shows this is not the case. On more than one occasion, as we've seen in the video, during the Boxer Rebellion, the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese Army defeated the Eight Nation Alliance despite the perceived advantages the Eight Nations had. And furthermore, even when the Eight Nation Alliance defeated the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese Army, it only came after heavy fighting in battles where the Eight Nation Alliance barely won and suffered heavy casualties thanks to the skilled marksmanship of Chinese soldiers. Furthermore, the assumption of superiority repeatedly led the Eight Nation Alliance to underestimate the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese Army with disastrous results. Therefore, the Boxer Rebellion is a perfect example of the myth and the lie that is the superiority of European empires and the United States Empire. And if you want a bigger look, a much more detailed look than even my video into the breakdown and sort of debunking of this myth, I highly recommend this book here, The Boxer Rebellion and the Great Game in China, which I will cite in the sources of the video. All right, so with that, that brings an end to our video. I hope all of you watching learned a lot. And I hope all of you are going to, or at least some of you are going to use what you learned in this video to sort of further educate other people on the subject and other related subjects and help further debunk this myth of European superiority and United States superiority, and also the superiority of white people, etc., etc. Because it is an incredibly pervasive myth that unfortunately just will not go away, as we've seen in the current administrations of multiple Western nations, including the United States and other European nations. So again, I really hope that you learned a lot, and you liked that you learned a lot of this information, as disturbing as a lot of it was. And I hope you take it to educate people in the real world. So with that ends our video. If you would like to see me cover any of the subjects I discussed in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you all have a good day.